we're going to start with just a description, I think, of Peerceptiv. So, Kati, from the instructor perspective, how would you describe the Peerceptiv platform, the tool?
Yeah, so Peerceptiv is a double-blind, cloud-based calibrated peer review platform. Double-blind meaning the students that do the reviews don't know who they're reviewing, and when they receive reviews, they don't know who reviewed theirs in ideal circumstances. The nice thing about Peerceptiv is scalable to just about any level, and it can be used for a variety of assignments, both written essays and other types of assignments. I've used it for written assignments, but I've also used it for multimedia assignments. So there's a lot of different things you can do with it. It's can work with just about any level or size of the class.
Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of using Peerceptiv from an instructor perspective first. And specifically, I'd like to hear more about assessment and grading, because those are the questions that we often hear from instructors.
Okay, so the benefits from the instructor level is that you have an active, it's set up so that the students are actively engaged in the process through peer-to-peer teaching and learning, and there's also some collaborative learning. I would say that one of the huge benefit of Peerceptiv is the time saving, and that gets back to how it calculates grades. So Peerceptiv uses research-backed algorithms. They have 10 years worth of data that they've been using to create these algorithms that generate valid and reliable grades. And there's multiple checks along the way, and there's multiple places in which the instructor can intervene to set, adjust the grades however the way they need to. But the instructor can override grades and direct the grade generation, but there's a lot of power in how much time can be saved with grades. So the time savings was the big thing for me. It changed my game. So it allows students to receive high quality feedback and their grade in a really timely manner. So before I was using Peerceptiv, I had about 200 essays that I needed to grade within a week, every other week. And it was completely untenable. Like I was running myself into the ground and my TA. And I couldn't get the feedback fast enough so that the students could take what I had to say about one assignment before they started on the next version of it, because it was an iterative assignment and they're supposed to improve as they went along, but they couldn't do that because I couldn't get feedback fast. And of course, there's also grader fatigue. By the time you're 150 essays in and 200 essays, we're all going to admit that it might not go as smooth as you had in the first ones. So comparing my grades to before I used Peerceptiv and after, I would say that the grades are as reliable and as accurate, if not more accurate than before, because I've eliminated grader fatigue and I have a variety of spot checks that I can use. I tell my students that grading through Peerceptiv actually benefits them in a variety of ways, especially in the grade, and that there's multiple places in which their grade is determined, and they have more agency and ownership in how their grade is determined. So it's not just I'm going to write an essay and then I'm just going to leave it to the whims to see how it gets graded. But there's a variety of ways that students can be engaged and be actively involved and have ownership and agency in their grade. So that's what I would say. That it changed my game in terms of how I graded and how much I could do in my course.
Okay, hopefully people like what they're hearing. So let's talk about the benefits from the student perspective. And in this case, the questions we often hear are related to learning in general and critical thinking specifically.
Okay. So I would say that the benefit from the student is that they're actively engaged in the learning process. You really can't fluff your way through this. And if you do fluff your way, it's going to show in your grade and in a variety of places. So they're going to be engaged in the process. One, because they have to create the thing that they're going to submit in Peerceptiv, but then they have to go through the process of critiquing their peers, improving their work product based off of the feedback that they get. So there's organic incentives for active participation because the scores are associated with how well they engage and how well they perform at each stage of the process. So there's active engagement involved. So the critical thinking comes in a variety of ways. So one is that there's peer-to-peer teaching going on. So granted, it's anonymous. They don't know who they're giving reviews to, and they don't know who they're receiving reviews for, but they're going to have to know the assignment well enough, know the content that built the assignment that was supposed to be built into or used to create the assignment, and then have to know the rubric well enough that they can provide meaningful and accurate feedback and scores for their peers. So I have to say that I think students develop their critical thinking skills because they need to consider how each of their peers are assigned, the scores that they assign to each of their peers, and they have to justify that score when they give it. So students are deeply engaged. They're going to utilize higher order thinking skills because they have to read, they have to write, they have to analyze, evaluate, informed judgments about their peers. So there's a lot of higher order thinking skills that are involved other than just, I'm going to do the assignment that you gave me and I'm just going to give it to you and I'm going to walk away. There's a lot more higher order thinking skills involved.
So Kati, we've got a couple of questions that I think it would be useful to just pause and consider right now. One of them has to do with whether or not students have the opportunity to revise their work in response to the critiques that they receive in the system.
So you could set it up in a variety of ways. So I'm going to give the example later. I have a worldview essay that I do, and I do 3 of them. So the first one, generally, the students do moderately okay, but then they gradually get better. By the third one, they're doing really well. So the system is set up so that a student submits some assignments, they get peer review, and then they get feedback on the peer review they received, and then there's a grade. So what you could do is you could ultimately do multiple rounds of peer review to have the students make improvements on the next submission. So you could do it that way. And in that, like, say if you're going to do one big paper, maybe you go through 2 rounds of peer review in the process of creating the paper. So I think it's absolutely possible.
Okay, and the next question has to do with, are the students learning the critical thinking process or the subject matter?
Is it either or? Is that the question?
That seems to be the question. And when I read this, I thought really, ideally, the assignment design means that they're doing both. You have to be working with the subject matter.
Yeah, this is Suresh. It was I who asked the question. The question is, it's one thing to learn the mechanics of critical thinking and writing a good paper. Was at the end of the semester, do they actually learn the subject matter? So whether this particular perceptive program, what does it actually measure in terms of outcomes, right? That's really at the end of the semester. Yes, critical thinking is critically important, but at the end of the semester, I'm very interested to know if they have learned the subject matter.
Okay, I see your point. And I think it all comes back to how you develop your rubric. So we'll look at some examples. I'll give you some examples of my rubric later, but I would absolutely say that I think I'm able to determine how well my students understand the subject matter based off of the way that I've set my rubric up, so that I can see, yes, they have mastered. Where do they stand on mastery of this concept? You can build that into your rubric. And that would be a way that I would say that you could determine whether or not they've mastered that course content. So it all depends on how you set the assignment up. But yes, I think absolutely it does work that way.
So our next question actually should help clarify that even more. So this is an opportunity, Kati, to describe how Peerceptiv works. So just walk the participants through your approach to how you're using the program in your class.
Well, that's actually the next slide that I have. Yeah, that actually worked out well. So Peerceptiv works that there are 3 stages. So there's a submission stage. So this is not different than anything you've ever done, that you give students instructions for an assignment and they're going to submit. And so that's the first thing that they do. And then they go into the peer review stage. And you can make these stages as long as you need them to be. But during the peer review stage, so after they submit, and I have a grace period of 24 hours, and so then then they can start the peer review phase. And you can only do the peer review phase during that period of time. So they're going to review their peers, and you set the number of peer reviews that are required. And three is the minimum, really, to allow enough data to make the system work. And so after the peer review is done, then the peer review stage will close, and then you have the feedback stage, which is technically optional, but I use it. And the feedback stage is when peers give feedback to the peers that gave them reviews, or gave them feedback. So if I'm a student and I'm in the class and I've received peer review feedback from 3 of my peers, during the feedback stage, I am going to rate how well my peers gave me feedback. How helpful was their information? How helpful were their comments? How closely aligned were their scores with the rubric? So if they're totally off base, then I would score them low in the helpfulness. So the grade is a combination. The grade in Peerceptiv is a combination of a few things. So the first is the review grade, and this comes from the peer review stage. And so this is the accuracy of the peer reviews and their helpfulness scores. So how accurate are they? So if they're totally off base and they haven't paid attention to the rubric at all, then their accuracy will go down, and that will reflect in their review grade. Their helpfulness score, that's how helpful were you to your peers, and that happens, you get that score from the feedback stage. The next one is the document grade. So this is determined using accuracy adjusted ratings and algorithms. So that's where the system takes all of those peer review data and adjusts it and creates the document score. We can get into that, how that actually happens. But how I use Peerceptiv is there's 2 ways you can do it. You can use it curved, where you only use the peer review data to create the grade. I prefer to use the benchmark approach, which means that after the peer review stage is done, the system will identify the top 5 and the bottom 5 reviews or papers, and then I will score those myself. And then my score overrides everything else and adjusts the curve. And that is how the scores are set. And then the last portion of the grade is the task grade. And this is the percent of required reviews that students do, and the percent of their feedback. So did they basically do their peer reviews, and did they do their feedback? And so you can weight each one of these individually. The way that I have it set up is I do the document score is worth 60%, the review score is worth 20, the task score is worth 20, but you can adjust these as you would like. I think the default is that the review and the document grade are both worth 40, and the task grade is worth 20. So however you would like to do it, you can. Would now be a good time to go into showing an example? Or I saw that there were several things coming up on chat. So
right, there are several things coming up, and there are concerns that we've talked about before in various Q&A sessions. One has to do with, or if peer feedback is poor and that sort of thing. Is
we can talk about that.
Possible to have that problem skew things? And the related question: are you spending time in class teaching the students how to complete the process? What sort of guidance are they getting to help them be not inept?
Okay. Yep. We can talk
about review.
Okay. Yes, and I'm sorry, it's getting darker in here, and I'm not quite sure why. So I apologize that I'm appearing darker. So the lighting in my office is a little odd. So the first question about do I spend time in class? And I have some information about buy-in that we'll talk about later. I absolutely do. I teach this class. I use Peerceptiv in both asynchronous. Well, now it's all asynchronous, but before the pandemic, it was an asynchronous online class and a face-to-face class. And yes, I spent time at the very beginning of the semester talking about how this system works. And I've created a video, which I've given a link for, like how Peerceptiv works, how the grades are calculated. I have that all. I give that to the students in the beginning of the class. And really at the beginning of the semester, I spend at least half a day talking about Peerceptiv and working on buy-in. That's a big thing. So in terms of the question of can one student skew someone's grade horribly in one direction or the other. Generally, no, it can't happen that way. Because the way that it works out is I tell my students, okay, let's say each essay needs 3 reviews. And so when that happens, so let's say, we'll say Jean is the student that's getting reviewed, and I'm just looking at the names that I can see right now. Grace, John, and Suresh are the ones that are going to be reviewing Jean. And so let's say that Grace and John have decided that they're investing the time, they're doing it the way they need to be doing it, and they're spending the time to make sure they do it right. And Suresh, I'm sorry, you were busy and you got in like 5 minutes before it was due, and you just clicked numbers and you just decided to give 7s across the board, and you didn't really give good feedback, or you gave 1s across the board because you were rushing. So the ones that the score that Suresh gives, which is off base compared to Grace and John, it will be compared. And so Grace and John's weight of their scores will weight heavier than Suresh. Additionally, Suresh's scores are going to be flagged by the system as conflicting rating documents or conflicting rating. And then I go in and I check this. And so I would go in and I'd look at Jean's essay and I'd say, okay, Grace and John are on point, Suresh is off. I'm going to score this myself, and my score will be the one that everything is adjusted to and considered the gold standard, and that her score won't be adversely affected by Suresh's. Actually, even if I didn't put that score in, the fact that the system will recognize that Suresh's scores are off compared to others will make it so that his scores weight less than others. So the system does account for those types of issues. And I have more about buy-in a little bit later.
Thanks, Katie. There was another question here about the types of assignments that can be submitted. And we actually included a link to a white paper that Peerceptiv has up on their site, and we'll come back to that later. And they include about 7 creative ways that you can use the system, including podcasts. So it is possible to have the students submit all sorts of different types of assignments and formats and still utilize this system.
Yes, it absolutely is. There's a variety. It can accept a variety of file types. The one thing I will say about that is you can only submit one thing. Like if you wanted them to submit, I discovered this because I was trying to do something else. I wanted them to submit a podcast and a transcript and a vision. Like it had to all be packaged into one thing that was turned in yourself. So it just needs to be one thing that's turned in, or you can adjust how you execute your assignment.
So I'm seeing some other questions, but I think we can move on to the walkthrough that you've planned of an example assignment, and we can actually perhaps address a lot of these in the context of that.
Let's do that. Okay. So one big question that's been going on since last fall, actually since we knew we were going to have this, was, is Peerceptiv going to be LTI integration into Canvas? And it wasn't in the fall. I can tell you that I used it still, and there created a few headaches, but it is now. And so I can tell you that I've used it in eCampus. I am going to be using it in Canvas this semester, and I've also used it from its website outside of an LMS. But I will show you my Canvas course for spring. So this is my spring 2021, the ESE 201 course, and I've already set up Worldview reflection number 3. I have a link for how I will provide a link of how you do this, how you set up your assignments in Canvas with Peerceptiv. But so here I have, this is really just the assignment information, like everything that the students need. I give them, I explain the assignments, I give them a template, I give them the rubric, I give them examples of strong and weak versions of this assignment. And then I tell them, you're going to need to submit this in Peerceptiv. So then when they go to Peerceptiv, I'm actually going to show you my past semester so that you can see we have a richer set of data to work with. So when you open in Peerceptiv, you would see a tile. So here I have, this is one of the assignments that I've created. And so I can go in and I can manage my assignments. And there's very recently, in January of this year, a new platform, like visual presentation platform. So the main thing that with Peerceptiv, the key with everything is the rubric. And so you want to make sure that the rubric you curate is specific enough and tailored enough that the students can accurately score their peers, and it can be consistent from one use to the next. And so the way that you can look at your rubric is you come over here to rubric, and I have multiple, they call them dimensions. So there's multiple things that I'm asking my students to look at. So, and it is recommended that you ask them to look at more than just grammar and punctuation, because if they're just looking at grammar and punctuation, we're really not getting to the critical thinking skills. So here I have an explanation of the worldview. So that's the first thing I ask my students to look at. Did your peer explain their worldview clearly and clearly? So you can see I've got a 7, a 6, a 5, a 4, 3, 2, and 1. You can have anywhere from 1 to 10. I use 7. That was originally the number that was allowed. I think last year they upgraded to 10, and I've just stayed with 7 because too many options makes it so the student doesn't know. Like, you don't want to give them so many options that they don't know what they're going to select. And I've also given this a weight of 2 because I think that they should be able, that was more important to me than the grammar and punctuation, which only has a weight of 1. So then I'll go down to the quality of their collection. So I've given them information. So they need to, this is something that the reviewer would look at, as well as the student looks at when they're writing their essay. Did the student provide specific reasons as to why they formed their worldview the way they did? And you'll notice it says comments required 1. That means that when a student is giving peer review, they have to 1, select the number that they think their peer's essay reflects, and 2, they have to give a comment that justifies why they gave that score. So then we can go down, and I've got correct inclusion of course terms, and this is a weight of 1. It's not as important, but being able to correctly define the word to make sure they're using it in context, that was more important to me. Grammar and spelling. And so at this point, I can't edit this one because this is a past assignment, but there would be a big circle down here with a plus sign. That would be a place where I could add an extra dimension. So if I wanted to add another one for a future assignment, I could put a button here, and then I could add another dimension. And this right here, grammar and spelling is 1 dimension, explanation of your worldview is another dimension. So that is my rubric. And we have examples of, I have 2 different example rubrics in some resources that we'll provide. Other things that are really helpful. One of the reasons I love Peerceptiv is the rich data. I've tried one other peer review platform, and by and far, you get way more data from Peerceptiv. And the reason I'm looking at it, showing you a past course, is to show you the rich data that is available. So one thing I really like is stats. So here I can look at, so we were looking at worldview number 3, so we'll continue to look at that. I have the completion rate for submissions, reviews, and back evaluation. So I can see what % of my students are doing this. But I can also go into view detailed stats. And here I can see that information again, whose documents are missing, who was late. I can waive them as needed. I can check out if there are documents that have few reviews. It's done now, so that doesn't happen. But as the reviews get closer, there would be a button that I could point, and I could remind everyone that hadn't done their things, reviewers that have much to do. This is super helpful, conflicting rating documents. So here, this tells me that Abby Johnson has conflicting ratings from her peers based off of correct inclusion of course concepts. So what I can do is I can go view her document, I can view her reviews, and then I can enter my teacher score if I wanted to. So just to see where's the confusion or what's happening here. This is very helpful. I can check out my late reviews, see who has much to do. But from an assessment plan standpoint, like an academic assessment, I am the assessment liaison in my department. This has been super helpful, this quantitative data. So I can use it to see what the mean explanation of worldview is. So this is a data set that I will use when I actually assess my course at the end of every academic year. It's super helpful. So that is a short introduction to that. Question or more questions, Jean?
There are more questions.
Yeah, I imagine there would be.
Okay. By the way, we have some tips and suggestions from people in here that I hope folks are reading that are helpful. So we have a question about, could a requirement be to support a score with a specific example?
You could. So what I tell my students when they're giving feedback is to give an example, to explain why they gave the score. So let's go look at, it'd be helpful if we went back to my rubric so we can use that as an example. So the quality of reflection. So this is where my students usually falter. So this assignment is designed so that I want my students to think about the course content, but then apply it to their lives. And so I ask them to think about a variety of environmental situations or environmental issues and what their worldview is on it. So for example, one I give them is, should we spend all our money focusing on trophy species and charismatic species such as the panda and the cheetah and the giraffe and the lion and all of that, and think that the money is going to trickle, like protecting the environment for them trickles down and saves the less well-known ones, like the mice and rodents and things like that. Or another example I give is China's one-child policy. Does the government have the right to tell a population how many children people should have? I tell my students there is no right or wrong answer, but I do tell them you need to be able to explain what your worldview is using the course concepts in context, defining them, and making sure you're explaining your worldview in a way that makes sense with the course concepts. So it's not that I'm telling them I'm going to score you based off of what your worldview is. I say you need to be able to explain your worldview using the course concepts. So that's explaining the worldview. The second part is the reflection and the critical thinking. I tell them you need to tell me how this came to be. How did you form your worldview? And this is reflection I've discovered is not the strong point of many students. And so we're working on that, but I remind them to not repeat their worldview. So now you need to tell me how you formed it. Was it that you were raised in a certain way, and give me examples? So I tell them you need to give specific examples of how you formed this worldview. And I tell them how I was raised, this is the class I took, or this is what my religion teaches me, are all nice starts, but we need to dive a little deeper. You really need to reflect as to how you formed this worldview. And so the reflection is where students falter. And so what I've noticed is it's very helpful if I tell my students, when you're giving feedback to your peers, give them examples of how they could have improved, or give them examples. So if they didn't score well, like let's say they score a 2, give them an example of, this is what you did, but if you would have done this, it would have improved your score. If they did really well, identify what it was that they did really well. Because if I got 7s across the board, but I don't know why I got 7s across the board, or I don't know why I got the best score, then it's going to be hard for me to repeat it. So some of this comes back to training the students and teaching the students how to give good quality feedback. And that comes back to explain why they got the score they did, give an example.
Okay, so we have a question here that is a great segue into our next question in preparing for this. And the question is, how do you respond to student complaints if the prof isn't grading their work?
Okay.
And our question was, how can instructors get student buy-in?
How do you get buy-in? Okay, let's go to the buy-in question. So getting buy-in. All right, so explaining the process. At the beginning of the semester, in the first week, I don't talk about the syllabus usually until the third day. One of the first things I talk about is peer review and Peerceptiv and the value of it. I talk to them about how they can get faster feedback, more feedback, and just as reliable feedback when we use this system. I created a video that explains. So this is put in YouTube, and I embed it. You're more than welcome to use it as you like, but it explains how Peerceptiv works. It does have screenshots of the old interface, but it's still the same idea. And so I spend time with students explaining how this system works. And we have an informative Q&A session after we get through the explanation of how the system works. One thing I really talk about, and I drive this home the whole semester, is that students are not grading each other. And that's been my qualm with some of the other peer review softwares I've seen, is that even in their informational brochures or whatnot, they talk about students grading each other. That's not what's happening here. The students are providing data that I use and the system uses to grade the students. So if a student ever comes to me and says, this other student graded me, I'm like, no, they did not grade you. They gave you a score, which was used by me to give you a grade. So making sure that we debunk that. Also making sure that the students realize that their writing scores, their document score, is not just an average of the scores they receive from the peers. It is a much more complicated algorithm than that. And there are systems or there are checks in place to make sure that if someone gives you a poor score, a low score that is discongruent with all the other scores you receive, it's not going to adversely affect your grade. The system is set up to adjust for that and account for it. And then the last thing that I tell them is I have a regrading policy. And I got this from Dr. Heather Wilkinson, and her policy is, if you don't like the score that you got in Peerceptiv, I will happily grade your essay, but I will let you know that I tend to be a much stricter grader, and there's no going back. So you can take my score, or you can, which you don't know, or you can take the score that you got from Peerceptiv. So the regrading policy, I've only actually had to use it on a handful of occasions. So I think the other reason that I talk about this getting buy-in is I talk with students about how we no longer live in a world where you're ever going to write something that gets published that's never seen by anyone else. No matter what you go on and do. I worked in the environmental industry for several years before I came into higher ed, and I would write a report that I had to pass through multiple peers before it even got to my supervisor, which then went on to the client. And so I got feedback all along the way. So this is an important skill to learn and develop. One, how to give good quality feedback, but two, how to receive it, like how to receive critiques, use it to improve your own writing. It's how writing happens, and it's a good time now to explain to students, in the future, you're going to have to work collaboratively to write things. And it's important that you learn these skills now, so we're going to go through this process.
So yes, the session's being recorded. Somebody has that. Is Perceptive available in Canvas yet? So yes, in the November 11th update from AI regarding the spring course shells in Canvas, Peerceptiv was listed as one of the LTIs that had been integrated with Canvas. I reached out to AI to find out if they would be doing any tech-oriented sessions on Perceptive for the spring, and they did not know when those sessions would be available, which was another motivator for our offering this session today. But it is available, and when Kati was showing you her Canvas course for this spring, she's already been in there to create an assignment, a Peerceptive assignment that will run in Canvas. Okay, the Worldview document is a personal statement. How do students feel about peer grading when they are writing something subjective, which makes them vulnerable?
Good question. So I talk with my students about this in that I tell them, and this is very specific to my assignment, but I can see how it could happen in other places. I tell my students, you need to explain what your worldview is, and then you need to explain how you. And I do remind them, I was like, if this is so personal that you really don't want to share it, then I give them multiple prompts. So they have 3 prompts to choose from. So they have 3 different worldview prompts to choose from when they write their essay. And so I say, if one of them is super personal and you don't want to share that information, then pick a different prompt. I would say that that's another nice thing about the double blind system. Students are given a pseudonym, which generally is a random color and a number. So like Sienna 2534. It's important that students be informed that that's going to happen, because I have had students come back to me and say, I don't know what's going on. There's this label that's on my worksheets. It's like, no, that's your pseudonym. So no one's going to know who is who. So as long as they don't put their name in their essay anywhere, they don't allude to who they are, then they can hide behind some anonymity, because no one's going to know except me. I know who everyone is.
Okay, there's a question here about how do you explain the accuracy score, how the accuracy scores work to the students?
Okay, so I largely use my Peerceptiv explained video. It's explained in that. There is at the bottom of this slide deck, there's a variety of links, and one of them is Peerceptiv grades and detailed explanation for instructors. And so I basically explain exactly, I boil this page down to them, and I explain to them how their score is going to be determined. And if we go to the submission grade, so it's submission grade is a weighted average of how reviewers rated the work product according to the rating prompts, and accounts for the reviewing accuracy. And then I tell them I benchmark everything. So I get the top 5, I get the bottom 5, I score those, and that adjusts the curve. Generally, between that and the video, students are pretty satisfied with how their score is determined.
Looks like I missed a question earlier, and this is about, once you've done all this work, is it easy to use these assignments in the next iteration of the course?
Oh, so much easier. Yeah, so there's a button in Peerceptiv that you can just say, copy assignment. So once you build it, you just copy it again. And I copy them over and over and over again. I make adjustments as I need, but yes, I copy them. And one tip I had was, if you're going to have an iterative assignment, so like my worldview, I learned in recent past from Dr. Kelly Wilkinson to make if you have an iterative assignment, if possible, make the rubric the same, so that the students are calibrated. They don't have to guess what it is from one to the next. And then you can use the same rubric over and over and over again.
So someone's asking if you could pull up and show them exactly how you access Perceptive in Canvas.
Yeah. All right, so this is my spring 2021. I haven't imported anything. I just built this one. So if I want to create a new assignment, what I can do is I can go to assignments. I need to do this anyway. I will the worldview reflection number 1. I'll insert text here later. Mine are 50 points. I'm going to group them with worldview essays, display points. Okay, so when you get to this part, so this is, for whatever reason, it's automatically here, but there's multiple options. So no submission. So that's not what we need, but that's used for a variety of other things. Online, that's like if they're going to submit something separate that's not Peerceptiv. But what you want is the external tool. And then you can find, and when you press find, it will come up with a window that you can scroll down and see all the LTI linked external packages or programs that we can use in Canvas. You click on that, you find Peerceptiv. I'm not sure. Can you see the small configuration external tool window? Okay. So we'll scroll down. We'll find Peerceptiv. You click on that. You select it. Now you can see that link there. And then I press save. And here, this is not what I was telling you about copy a previous assignment. So now I can copy and paste an assignment. So what I can do is I can copy my Worldview number 1 from fall. So I'm just going to use it over again. It worked really well. I'll copy Worldview spring 2021. I need to select my dates. I might have to adjust these later, but I'm just going to select the dates. I generally give 2 weeks for review stage, but you can possibly do it a bit less. And then once you have those submission dates, and there's a couple other settings which we have slides for later, I can press copy assignments. I need a valid. Oh, they can't submit in the past. That's okay. Let's do that. Copy assignment. So now we can see we have Worldview number 1 and Worldview number 2, and I will admit that this is I'm not as experienced using Peerceptiv in Canvas, but this is generally how it's going to work. So I'm going to go back to assignments. I'm going to click on my Worldview number 1, and now this you can see this is a LinkedIn. This is a page from the Worldview reflection, or this is what it looks like in Peerceptiv. So does that answer the questions?
There was another question about whether this is available in eCampus.
It is.
And it is, and it has been for some time, but I don't think we have access to an eCampus course to show.
Oh, I can show you if you'd like, because I've worked in Peerceptiv in eCampus, in Canvas, and just out of their website. So if that would be helpful.
Yeah, we've got a couple of people asking about what this looks like in eCampus. And then while that's coming up, we have another question about how do you take a score and then convert it to an actual grade you give a student in your class?
Okay.
Approaches to that.
Let me open can we come back to that? Just hold on to that one and remind me as I get to this. So I'm going to go to my eCampus. Summer, just trying to remember how. Then I'm going to go over. So here I did Worldview reflections. In eCampus, you'll get this little figure, this little icon when you create things. If I want to create a new assessment, how you would build one in eCampus is you come up to this assessment toolbar, you go down to Peerceptiv, you click on that, you enter the name, you can attach files like the template or Rubric, whatever. You want to enable evaluation. That's key. Make sure you click that button. Permit viewers to view this content. When you enable that, it will ask you for the points. You want to enter the points, make sure it's visible to students. And usually I make the due date the submission date. There's multiple due dates. You can only put one. So I usually make it the submission. So then I do want to point out that I have closed my other one because you should not have Peerceptiv open in multiple windows at a time. Just don't do it. It doesn't really like to play. It doesn't play well that way. So just have one window open at a time. So we'll look at. So when my students click on this, they are going to be sent to Peerceptiv, and that's where they are now. So as well as I am. And now the landing board or the dashboard looks the same whether you're working in Canvas, eCampus, or actually out of Peerceptiv's website. You can work out of Peerceptiv's website. Like if you wanted to not link to an LMS, it is possible. I did it in the spring. I don't necessarily think it's worth it. It created some headaches that were really difficult to work through. So I do recommend working with Peerceptiv, linking it from an LMS. It eliminates a headache that you don't want to deal with. Okay, so the second question is unrelated. You can go back to that question.
It had to do with how you convert the score from Peerceptiv to an actual grade in the class.
Okay, So in eCampus, where I go. I haven't done it in Canvas. I'm just going to tell you that. So that's harder. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to happen in Canvas, but I can tell you how it happened in eCampus, which I presume it will be similar. So what happens is I'm going to go to manage my assignments, and buttons change. But you can, what happened in eCampus was once I finalized grades, I could, there was a button that I could push that sent the grades to the grade book in eCampus. And so it was automatically linked, and so the grades would go from Peerceptiv to eCampus. And so when you look at the grades in Peerceptiv, so if I were to pull up a student, you would notice that their Peerceptiv or their Worldview essay was out of 100 points, but I only actually make it worth 50 points in eCampus. And so it would automatically calculate when it got pushed to eCampus. It is also possible to download your gradebook out of Peerceptiv and upload it into your LMS. That's possible as well. But there should be, I'm willing to bet that Canvas is going to do the same thing in that the gradebooks are linked. And once you finalize your grades, it can push towards your LMS, push back to your LMS.
Megan's actually responded to that question too, saying in chat, the grades are linked from Perceptive to either eCampus or Canvas as long as the assignment is set up in one of those LMS platforms. And there was also a question in here about what Perceptive does with the data they collect, because as you pointed out, Katie, the system gives you access to a lot of data that's very useful for instructors. And Megan was saying that it isn't sold to third parties or anything of that nature for folks who had that concern. All right. Now we're going to go on to, as an experienced user of Perceptive, would you share some lessons learned? Like don't have more than one window open at a time? And steps to avoid.
Yeah, so let's go with key points to be aware of. We've already talked about buy-in. Rubric is key. The students need to be able to know what qualifies for what score on the rubric. It needs to be clear. It needs to be repeatable from one to the next. They need to know. So make sure that your rubric is clear. And I'm just going to warn you, it'll probably take multiple iterations. It took me a little while to get the exact rubric that made sure that the students were scoring close to the way that I did. And you'll notice there will probably be that conflicting ratings document is one thing that will help you recognize whether or not you need to tweak your rubric, but you'll get there. Tell your students that there's a double-blind pseudonym so that they don't worry about the fact that they've been assigned a name and a color. Track the conflicting rating documents. Sometimes I will spot check during the peer review process, so I'll just go in and randomly score some students, and that adds another level of my investment or my that just adds a little bit more of my grading into the system. It works without it, but sometimes when I have the time, I will go in and do that, and that's just me being able to interact more with my students. Review scores of zeros. So I will give you a warning on this one. And Megan from Peerceptiv is, I think she's in the room now. But if your students, one thing I learned was that some students, there are ways to game the system, which we'll talk about. We'll come back to the lessons learned, and let's talk about gaming the system because I figured this out. So some students will mail in their reviews, and what that might look like is that the students will give 7s across the board, and they might even copy their comment for each of the elements of the rubric over and over and over again. I would call that mailing it in. Oftentimes this will happen really close to the submission deadline. You can go in and look and see what their activity was, like when they logged in, how long they spent on a review. You can see all that. And so if you notice that they spent 1 minute reviewing, then you know they probably mailed it in. So if a student, so let's say I'm a student in my class, Jean's in my class, and she has done 3 reviews and she gave 7s for all elements of the rubric for all of her reviews. Her review score is going to be a 0 because the system is going to flag that as highly, highly improbable and recognizes that that student has probably nailed it in. On an occasion, it's happened that it was actually authentic, and the student that was doing the reviews actually got 3 excellent examples. It happens, and if that's the case, then I can go in and I can override it. But just be aware that students will mail it in. Some students will. Telling them ahead of time, like at the beginning Q&A session, that you know how the system can be gained, and that you are you're watching, that you're involved, that you see everything. Letting them know that this is not some autonomous system that's just running in the background and you're not paying attention. That's one thing that I like to do. I alert students that I can override any activity and that I can change any grade, and I will, and I have. I tell students that it is possible to cheat in Peerceptiv, and if they choose to do that, there are multiple ways this can happen. I've seen it happen where one student submitted 1 essay and then they submitted the same essay the next time. That's considered multiple submissions. And so at the beginning of the semester, my students actually have to go through a very rigorous academic dishonesty quiz, which if you would like that, you can check it out at Oak Trust. And they know that you can't submit something twice for the same credit. I also tell them that the mailing it in, like 7s across the board for all of the reviews, that's fabrication. So that's making up data. And so I tell them, if you commit academic dishonesty, I'm going to report you to the Academic Honesty Office. And I like to tell the story that Craig Coates told me that when he started doing this, he did it over the summer, and he had 5 graduating seniors that by the end of the semester were not graduating seniors anymore because they had cheated in Perceptive. So I even have a question in my academic dishonesty quiz about cheating in Perceptive. So just letting you know that some students have thought that they could game the system, you have ways to make sure that they're held accountable for their choices. So lessons learned. There's a training assignment, which I like to use. So the training assignment I do at the beginning of the semester, they don't have to write anything. What it is they are given a good, like a high scoring example and a low scoring example, and they actually have to use the rubric to score it. So they go through the peer review process and the back evaluation process. And it's a really low points. This is a good time for students just to figure out how to navigate the system, how the system works. If there's anything that they need to do, like that's the good thing. Reusing rubrics, I've talked about this before. Here's the thing, do not upload your roster. Have the students, you don't need to do it. If you're linked in through an LMS, it happens automatically. Have your students access Peerceptiv through the LMS. Tell them this at the beginning of the semester, repeat it multiple times. And then when someone says, what is the class code? You will say, you were not listening. You need to access it through Peerceptiv. They will never need a class code. You can get it if you need it, but your students do not need the class code. They access it through Peerceptiv, saves a lot of headache. Don't have more than one window open at a time. Coming soon, Peerceptiv will be able to import groups from Canvas, which is super nice. It's very, very helpful. The support desk is amazing. I usually get my response back within very, very quickly, usually less than a day, often much faster than that. And I'm on first name basis with everyone over there. Provide enough time for each step. So just think about how rigorous or how in-depth your assignment is for peer review, and just make sure that you give them enough time for doing the quality reviews that you want. And then this gets back to some other things we talked about, debunk the idea of being nice in peer reviews. So some students have said, well, I didn't want to give a bad review because I wanted to be nice to my peer. And I talked to my students, like, that serves no one. Like, if you're not going to be honest about how I can improve, you're not helping. It doesn't help me to get an artificially inflated score because you think you're being nice to me. And it's not helpful for you as a score, for you as a peer review giving the review, and me as a student trying to get better. So I do try to talk with them at the beginning of the semester about debunking nice peer reviews. This isn't about, you're not judging me as a person, you're judging the quality of my writing. And so it's about the writing and how I can improve and what I did well and what I didn't do well. So please give feedback on that and make it about the writing and not about the person. So that gets back to giving good peer review, peer feedback. So before we go into the next part, Jean, are there more questions that come around that?
Well, there are some questions and some comments. One warning was some students will drop the class, but do not be tempted to delete them from Perceptive because it will result in a recalculation of grades across the board.
Yeah, be careful with that. I usually, a student drops a class, I don't delete them until I'm done with all of my Peerceptive assignments at the end of the semester. Actually, sometimes I won't even delete them, but because I do assessment, it can get really confusing when I'm going back and I'm doing assessments of my ESC course. So sometimes I'll just leave them in there.
Can you use both Perceptive and turn it in simultaneously in Canvas?
Katie, this is Megan. Can I answer that one?
Yes, please do.
Sure. So Canvas works like eCampus did in that you cannot, unfortunately, have students upload documents to Peerceptive and have Turnitin also go through that process. So, but what you can do, I believe that Turnitin has been linked in Canvas since the fall. So oftentimes instructors will have students upload the assignments to both Turnitin and Peerceptive by the same date. Turnitin gives you the information about plagiarism. Peerceptive allows the peer review process to happen. Those are separate apps that are not separate apps, but separate tools, and they are not linked. And there's no plan to link them for various reasons.
So another comment in here, this is listed as a warning, is tell students not to call out plagiarism in their reviews of each other because it can lead to some student interaction issues. They should flag suspected plagiarism to the TA or instructor to be dealt with. And somebody went and uploaded the link to your academic honesty.
Okay, great. Yeah.
There's been some talk back and forth about does Perceptive remove names from a file and how important is the double blindness. So there's an answer in here in chat that Peerceptive does not remove usernames from files, so they need to follow the instructions on how to submit and that the pseudonyms are assigned automatically. But the other question here is how important do you think the double blindness is to this process?
So I've done it. So I've used Peerceptive. So I've used Peerceptive for the Worldview essays. I really like the double blind. I don't want I think it adds a level of it just adds a level of security for the student. There are going to be some cases where the double blind was eliminated. So like I did a team project. I had Peerceptive. I used Peerceptive for a team project, and in that, the students created a presentation, and their names were on the as they do. Their names are on the first slide. And in that case, there's really no getting around it. And I have used a peer review platform in a smaller class that they ultimately knew who each other was. But I like having the double blind system for the vast majority of my accounts or the vast majority of my assignments. I will say one thing: if you're in a small class, if you have 10 or less submissions, you're going to do the same work whether you have 5 or 10. So the benchmark reviews that I was talking about before. So during my summer class, I think I had 10 groups, and so I had to I graded all 10, and so that adjusted the scores. But if you have less than 10, you're still going to do your benchmarks. So it all depends on if you have less than 10, then the students still are doing the peer review and they get that benefit. But because you're grading everyone, you might not see the benefits in time savings if you have a smaller class. because it scales really well for large classes. But I've still used it in small classes.
So related to the Peerceptiv and Turnitin question, somebody posted a tip here saying they use Peerceptiv for drafts and Turnitin for final versions of assignments that go in. For students that drop a class but want to opt out of reminder emails, is there a pre-made set of instructions for turning off the reminders?
I don't know about that. I know that there are students of mine that have dropped, and I'll send. There's a button that you can set. There's a button you can press for anyone that hasn't submitted their essay or their submission on time, or like it's getting close to the deadline. You can just push one button that sends a reminder to everyone. That will include people that have dropped the course, and you're not gonna, if you don't take them out of your Perceptive, then they're gonna get it. I've never really worried too much about that. So
a user says he thinks that Perceptive can remove students from future notifications and assignments.